Memory and imagination. Concerning memory and imagination, the tradition of Western thought seems to be involved in less dispute than it is in other aspects of human and animal life. There are, as we shall see, points of difficulty and debatable theories, but these arise only within the framework of certain fundamental insights which are widely, if not universally, shared. Here at least we can begin without having to deal with verbal ambiguities. Unlike many of the words, which are the traditional bearers of the great ideas, memory and imagination have a constant core of meaning in almost everyone's discourse. It is understood that memory and imagination depend upon sense perception or upon previous experience, except for illusions of memory. We do not remember objects we have never perceived, or events in our own life, such as emotions or desires, that we have not experienced. The imagination is not limited to the same in the same way by prior experience, for we can imagine things we have never perceived and may never be able to. Yet, even when imagination outruns perception, it draws upon experience for the materials it uses in its constructions. It is possible to imagine a golden mountain or a purple cow, though no such object has ever presented itself to perception. But as Hume suggests, the possibility of combining a familiar color and a familiar shape depends upon the availability of the separate images to be combined. When we think of a golden mountain, Hume writes, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were formerly acquainted. All this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. A congenitally colorblind man who lived entirely in a world of grays would not be able to imagine a golden mountain or a purple cow, though he might be able to imagine things as unreal as these. Because of their dependence on sense perception, memory and imagination are usually regarded as belonging to the same general faculty as the external senses. Not all writers, however, conceive of a generic power of sense, which they then divide into the exterior senses, such as sight, hearing, and touch, and the interior senses, such as memory and imagination. Some, like Hobbes, treat imagination as nothing but decaying sense, and use the word memory to express the decay and signify that the sense is fading, old, and past. The image, whether it is a memory image or fancy-free, reproduces or represents sensory material. It may be less vivid, less sharp in outline, and less definite in detail than the sensation or perception from which it is derived. But, in one important respect, the image does not differ from the original sense impression. That is, the respect in which ideas or concepts do differ from sense impressions, at least according to those who hold that ideas or concepts have a certain universality and abstractness, which is not found in sensations and sensory images. Those who, like Berkeley and Hume, call sensations or images ideas, deny the existence of abstract ideas or universal notions precisely because they, too, agree that sense impressions or sensory images are always particular in their content and meaning. The fundamental controversy about what an idea is and the verbal confusion occasioned by the ambiguity of the word, which appears in the chapter on idea, do not seem to affect the understanding of the nature of images or their role in the activities of memory and imagination. As William James points out, in discussing the blended or generic image which is somehow associated with abstract or universal meaning, a blurred thing is just as particular as a sharp thing, and the generic character of either sharp image or blurred image depends on its being felt with its representative function. He speaks of this function as the mysterious plus the understood meaning, but he denies the possibility of universal or abstract images. Whatever may be the truth about ideas which are not images at all. Certainly, those who deny the presence of anything abstract or universal in the understanding do so on the ground that the content of the mind is basically sensory, whether the mind is perceiving or remembering, imagining or thinking. The controversy about the nature of the mind does not seem to affect the conception of memory or imagination, as neither is confused with sense perception, so neither is confused with rational thought. This remains the case whether the theory of mind looks upon the intellect as a faculty separate from the sensitive faculty, including memory and imagination, or conceives the understanding as a single faculty which is active in judgment and reasoning, as well as in perceiving, remembering, and imagining. This and related issues are considered in the chapter on mind. Except for one point, perhaps such issues can be ignored here. Sensation is attributed to both animals and men, to all organisms which give evidence of having sense organs, or some sort of sensitive apparatus. Whether all animals, even those which have the most rudimentary sensorium, also have memory and imagination, may be disputed, but no one doubts that the higher animals, with central nervous systems and brain structures resembling those of men, can remember and imagine as well as perceive. All agree, furthermore, that memory and imagination require bodily organs. Though the assignments of these two functions to the brain as their organic seat is more uniformly a tenet of modern than of ancient physiology, and can be more clearly expounded as the result of modern researches in neurology. But the question whether the memory or imagination of men and other animals differs more than their bodies do elicits opposite answers from those who affirm that man alone has a reason, and those who deny that man has powers of knowing or thinking not possessed by other animals to some degree. Nevertheless, if man alone is considered, the nature of memory and imagination is clear. The object, remembered or imagined, need not be physically present to the senses like the object perceived. The object imagined need not be located in the past like the object remembered, nor, for that matter, need it have any definite location in time and space. It need have no actual existence. It may be a mere possibility, unlike the object, which cannot be known without being known to exist. As the object of memory is an event which no longer exists, so the object of imagination may be something which has never existed and never will. Thus, memory and imagination greatly enlarge the world of human experience. Without them, man would live in a confined and narrow present, lacking past and future, restricted to what happens to be actual out of the almost infinite possibilities of being. Without memory and imagination, man could be neither a poet nor an historian, and unless he had an angelic sort of intellect, which in no way depended on sense experience, he would be impeded in all the work of science if memory and imagination did not extend the reach of his senses. The psychological analysis of memory usually divides it into a number of separate acts or phases. Recollection presupposes the retention of the material to be recalled. The ingenious experiments of Ebbinghaus that James reports, using the memorization of nonsense syllables to isolate the factors influencing memory, seem to show that retention is affected by the strength of the original associations. But retention is also affected by the interval between the time of learning and the time of revival. The amount of forgetting seems to be the function of two separate factors. The force with which the material to be recalled is originally committed to memory, and the lapse of time. That retention is not the same as recall may be seen from Ebbinghaus's experimental discovery of the fact that forgetting is never complete. Material which lies below the threshold of recall is nevertheless retained, and manifests its presence by its effect on attempts to relearn the material which appears to have been forgotten. Nothing can be utterly forgotten if, as Augustine suggests, what seems to be forgotten remains in the memory. He considers the effort men make to remember a forgotten name. Where does that name come back from, he asks, except from the memory? For even when it is through being reminded of something else that we recognize someone's name, it is still by memory that we do it, for we do not hold it as some new thing learned, but by memory we are sure that this is what the name was. But were the name utterly blotted out of mind, Augustine argues, we should not remember it even if we were reminded. For if we had utterly forgotten it, we should not even be able to think of looking for it. Freud considers forgetting from another point of view. He describes the psychoanalytic method of its inception as a talking cure, involving efforts in reminiscence. The things which we have put out of mind, he claims, are hindered from becoming conscious and forced to remain in the unconscious by some sort of force. He calls this repression. Freud observed that it occurred when a wish had been aroused, which was in sharp opposition to the other desires of the individual, and was not capable of being reconciled with the ethical, aesthetic, and personal pretensions of the patient's personality. The end of this inner struggle was the repression of the idea which presented itself to consciousness as the bearer of this irreconcilable wish. This was repressed from consciousness and forgotten. On this view, things which have been put out of mind because we find them unpleasant to contemplate, things which are repressed in order to avoid conflict, are not forgotten when they cannot be consciously remembered, nor are they below the threshold of recall in the sense that our retention of them has been so weakened by time that no effort at recollection can revive them. On the contrary, they may be capable of quite vivid revival when the emotional obstacles to recollection are removed. Freud applies this theory of the obliviscence of the disagreeable to such everyday occurrences as the forgetting of familiar names, as well as to the repression of memories connected with the emotional traumas of early life. Recollection is distinct not only from retention, but also from recognition. The illusion known as déjà vu consists in the experience of intense familiarity with a place or scene that, so far as one can recall, has never been witnessed before. In contrast, normal recognition depends upon previous acquaintance with the object being cognized again, i.e., recognized. The fact noted by many observers that recognition may or may not be accompanied by recollection of the previous circumstances indicates the separation of recall and recognition as acts of memory, whereas recollection is remembering through the recall of images Recognition consists in remembering at the very moment of perceiving. Both, however, depend upon what seems to be memory's fundamental act, retention. With regard to retention, there are two problems which have been the subject of inquiry throughout the whole tradition. The first concerns what is usually called the association of ideas. From Aristotle through Hobbes and Hume to James and Freud, there have been various formulations of the laws of association and various interpretations of what such laws signify about the mind. Ebbinghaus, for example, used nonsense syllables in order to measure the effect upon retention of the associations formed by repetition of a series of sounds. All meaning had been removed in order to avoid the influence upon recollection of associations resulting from meaningful connections of the sort which exists among ordinary words. The repetition of nonsense syllables in pairs or series illustrates association by contiguity or succession. According to most writers, the elements of experience become associated through other modes of relation also, such as their similarity or contrast with one another in any significant respect. It is not the association itself which is remembered. Rather, it is through the association of one part of experience with another that memory seems to work, one particular tending to recall others with which it has been associated in one or more ways. Recollection seems to occur through activating connections which have been formed and retained. The modern differentiation of controlled and free association indicates two ways in which this can happen, either by a purposeful pursuit of the past or by the apparently chance recall of one thing by another. The ancients make a parallel distinction between reminiscence and reverie. The former is a process in which recollection resembles reasoning in proceeding step by step through a series of related terms. The latter is more like daydreaming or spontaneous fantasy. The second problem can be stated, perhaps, as the mystery of retention itself. In describing the capacity of the memory to hold the innumerable things which are not now in mind but can be recalled. The ancients speak of memory as the storehouse of images. Every variety of thing which can be perceived can be stored up in the memory, says Augustine, and called up at my pleasure. When I speak of this or that, he goes on, the images of all the things I mention are at hand from the same storehouse of memory. And if the images were not there, I could not so much as speak of the things. The things themselves are not brought into the memory. It is only their images which are seized with such marvelous speed and stored away marvelously as if in cabinets, and as marvelously brought forth again when we remember. The marvel of memory deepens into a mystery when we ask what the metaphor of the storehouse literally means. Where actually are the images when they are not actually in mind? If an image is by its nature an act of consciousness, whereby we apprehend objects not immediately present to our senses, how do images exist outside of consciousness during intervals when they do not function in remembering, imagining, or other acts of knowing? Their return to consciousness seems to imply that they have been retained, but where and how is the problem not solved by the metaphor of things stored away in a capacious barn. The physical storehouse does not require any fundamental transformation in the being of the things it holds between periods when they are actually in use. The memory does. The problem of the nature and cause of retention, William James seems to think, can be solved only in terms of the retentive power of nervous tissue, what he calls physiological retentiveness. Though in the view of others the problem becomes no easier, and may even be more complicated, when it is transferred from mind to matter. On either view, there seems to be no question that changes in the brain are somehow causally connected with the activity of memory and imagination, especially retention and recall. Aquinas, for example, observes that the imagination and memory may be hindered by a lesion of the corporeal organ, or by lethargy, an observation many times extended by more recent investigations of the brain pathology underlying amnesia and aphasia. James's treatment of retention as somehow based on pathways traced in the brain with recall, the result of a retracing of the paths, tends to emphasize the affinity between memory and habit. His theory, discussed in the chapter on habit, that the plasticity of matter, certainly living matter, underlies learning or habit formation, while the inertia or retentiveness of matter, especially the neural matter of the brain, explains memory or the persistence of habits during periods of disuse, seems almost to identify habit and memory. Ice skating, after many years of absence from the sport, is as much remembering how to ice skate as reciting a poem committed to memory in youth is the exercise of an old habit. Not all conceptions of habit and memory permit this fusion of the two, or even their affinity as related aspects of the same phenomenon. Aquinas, for example, restricts memory to an act of knowledge. The performance, popularly called reciting from memory, would not be for him an act of memory, though it might involve memory if the recitation were accompanied by knowledge of the time or place and occasion when the poem was first learned. Such knowledge would be a memory, but the recitation itself would not be any more than ice skating is. These performances represent the exercise of habits of skill or art. Makes sense. In view of this, Aquinas raises the question whether the act of knowledge of the sort involved in reconsidering a geometric proof learned at some earlier moment and now recalled to mind is an act of memory. The knowledge of this proof, which is retained by the intellect during periods when it is not actually exercised, he would call an intellectual habit or habit of knowledge. But should the recollection of this retained knowledge or the activation of this intellectual habit also be called an act of memory? Aquinas answers no, on the ground that no reference to the past need be involved in reworking a geometrical problem solved at some earlier time. But if the individual also happens to recall when he first solved the problem, that is another matter. Even so, Aquinas claims that if in the notion of memory we include its object as something past, then the memory is not in the intellectual but only in the sensitive part. The intellect is said to remember only in the sense of recalling a truth retained by habit, and not in the sense that it understands the past as something here and now. Memory is considered in still another way in relation to speculative truths about scientific or philosophical matters. The question is one of the origin of such knowledge, and the usual conception of memory as knowledge of past particulars. One traditional view, found in Aristotle, holds that out of sense perception comes to be what we call memory, and out of frequently repeated memories of the same thing develops experience. The generalized experience, which gives rise to induction and the apprehension of the universal. But in the tradition of the great books, we also find a more radical and perhaps less familiar conception of memory as the chief source of knowledge. This is Plato's doctrine of reminiscence, in which all learning is a kind of remembering of knowledge already present in the soul. All teaching takes the form of helping the learner to recollect things he may not be aware he knows, by reminding him through a process of questioning which awakens the knowledge already latent in him. In the Meno asks Socrates, "What do you mean by saying that we do not learn, and that we call learning, and what we call learning is only a process of recollection?" Socrates undertakes to show Meno what he means by taking a slave boy who appears not to know the solution of a certain geometrical problem, and merely by questioning him, without ever giving him a single answer, getting the slave boy to find the right solution for himself. Meno assures Socrates that the slave boy had never been taught geometry. Since the boy was not told the answer, he must have always known it, and needed only some reminding to remember what he knew. Socrates suggests the explanation that the boy's soul always possessed this knowledge, bringing it from another life. Before he undertook the demonstration with the slave boy, Socrates had proposed his hypothesis. The soul, being immortal, and having been born again many times, and having seen all things that exist, has a knowledge of them all. And it is no wonder that it should be able to call to remembrance all that it ever knew about virtue and about everything. For as all nature is akin, and the soul has learned all things, there is no difficulty in her eliciting, or as men say, learning, out of a single recollection all the rest, if a man is strenuous and does not faint. For all inquiry and all learning is but recollection. Though he differs from Plato in his conception of the soul and the origin of the knowledge which it innately possesses, Augustine seems to hold a similar view. As he examines his own memory, it appears to contain much that has not been implanted there by sense experience. Certain things referred to by words he understands, he says. Certain things referred to by words he understands, he says, I never reached with any sense of my body, nor ever discerned them otherwise than in my mind. Yet in my memory have I laid up not their images, but themselves. How they entered into me, let them say if they can. For I have gone over all the avenues of my flesh, but cannot find by which they entered. If the seeds of learning are in the soul at its creation, memory can draw from these seminal reasons the full fruit of knowledge. The doctrine of reminiscence changes the meaning of both learning and memory at the same time. When learning consists in remembering knowledge not acquired in this life, then the activity of memory cannot be, as it is usually conceived, a recollection of knowledge previously acquired in this life by learning. In order to understand a doctrine in which familiar meanings are so profoundly altered, it is perhaps necessary to understand the problem it tries to solve. That problem exists only for those who make an absolute distinction between particular sensory images and universal ideas or abstract concepts. Those who, like Hobbes, Berkeley, or Hume, deny universals or abstractions as any part of the mind's content see no special problem in the origin of that part of the mind's content which is not received as sense impressions. The original impressions are somehow externally caused. And all the rest of the mind's content, its images and memories, and all constructions of the sort, Locke calls complex ideas, then arise by nature derivation from the original sense impressions. But those who, on the contrary, maintain that ideas or concepts are not images of any sort cannot avoid the problem of how the mind comes by its ideas. One solution of this problem attributes existence to ideas as intelligible objects, and attributes to the mind the power to apprehend them by direct intuition, just as the senses directly apprehend sensible objects. But if ideas, whether or not they exist outside the mind, cannot be apprehended intuitively, then what is the origin of the ideas whereby the mind understands intelligible objects? To this question, the doctrine of reminiscence is one answer. Another answer is the doctrine of abstraction, as formulated by Aristotle and Aquinas. Locke and James also seem to recognize a distinction in kind between abstractions and other mental content, but they do not appear to find any need for a special power to perform the act of abstracting general ideas or universal concepts from the sensory particulars of perception and imagination. Aquinas, however, thinks that a special faculty called the active intellect must be postulated to account for the mind's possession of the ideas or concepts whereby it actually understands what it cannot perceive or imagine. These theories are considered in the chapters on idea and mind. But just as the doctrine of reminiscence is relevant here for its bearing on the discussion of memory, so the doctrine of abstraction which posits an active intellect is relevant to the discussion of imagination. Imagination, writes Aristotle, is different from either perceiving or discursive thinking, though it is not found apart from sensation or judgment without it. That this activity is not the same kind of thinking as judgment is obvious, for imagination lies within our own power whenever we wish, e.g., we can call up a picture, as in the practice of mnemonics, by the use of mental images. But in forming opinions, we are not free. We cannot escape the alternatives of falsehood or truth. The point is not that images cannot be false. They frequently are. As according to Aristotle, sensations never are. But the falsity of our imaginations involves a judgment that things really are as we imagine them to be. If imagination is not accompanied by judgment, the question of truth or falsity does not arise. For in pure imagination, we are not concerned with the way things actually exist, but with the possible, i.e., the imaginary, rather than the real. Everyone knows the difference, says James, between imagining a thing and believing in its existence. Conceiving imagination as an activity, depending upon the prior activity of the senses, Aristotle holds that imagination is incapable of existing apart from sensation. In this he does not differ from other psychologists. But he also holds that rational thought, which for him is quite distinct from imagination, cannot exist apart from imagination. To the thinking soul, images serve as if they were the contents of perception. That is why the soul never thinks without an image. Aristotle is here saying more than that a special faculty of mind or intellect abstracts the universal form, or what Aquinas calls the intelligible species, from the sensory matter of the image, or what Aquinas calls the phantasm. Aristotle is, in addition, insisting that the act of understanding is always accompanied by imaginative activity. The kind of thinking which depends upon the abstraction of ideas from imagery also depends upon the presence of images when the thinking takes place. The faculty of thinking, says Aristotle, thinks the forms in the images. Or as Aquinas expresses it, for the intellect to understand actually not only when it acquires new knowledge, but also when it uses knowledge already acquired, there is need for the act of imagination. It must of necessity turn to the phantasms in order to perceive the universal nature existing in the individual. The cooperation of the imagination with the intellect is shown, furthermore, by the fact that when the act of imagination is hindered by a lesion of the corporeal organ, we see that a man is hindered from understanding actually even those things of which he had a previous knowledge. Augustine, on the contrary, refers to things which we know within ourselves without images. When we consider numbers, for example, it is not their images which are in our memory, but themselves. The question of imageless thought, of thinking abstractly without the use of images, seems to be particularly insistent in sciences like mathematics, metaphysics, and theology, in which the conceivable may be imaginable, may not be imaginable. The objects peculiar to these sciences seem to require the scientist to do without imagery, or as Aquinas says, to rise above his imagination. This may be true even in physics. Atoms, according to Lucretius, are conceivable, but they are no more imaginable than they are perceptible. If we need images to think of them, we must use imagery in a metaphorical way, picturing the atom as the smallest particle imaginable, only more so. To the objection that there must be imageless thought if we can think of incorporeal beings, or of which there can be no images, or phantasms, Aquinas replies that we do so by comparison with sensible bodies, of which there are phantasms. Aristotle's theory that the operations of thinking are always dependent on, though not reducible to, acts of imagination does not imply that imagination is always accompanied by abstract or rational thought. Normally, human thinking and knowing is a work which combines both sense and intellect, both reason and imagination, but sometimes even in man, imagination may be active without judgment or reasoning. Brute animals, according to Aristotle, are largely guided by their imaginations, because of the non-existence in them of mind. But when imagination takes the place of thought in men, it is because of the temporary eclipse of their minds by passion or disease or sleep. Dreaming seems to be the striking case of imagination divorced from reason's judgment or control. It has long been suspected that animals also dream, but the question whether they can distinguish their dream from their waking perceptions may prove forever unanswerable. Philosophers and psychologists have, however, asked themselves whether there is any way of being certain of the difference between waking thought and the phantasmagoria of dreams. Descartes, for example, asks, how do we know that the thoughts that come in dreams are more false than those that we have when we are awake? It's like some Inception stuff. Seeing that often enough the former are not less lively and vivid than the latter, it seems to him that there are no certain indications by which we may clearly distinguish wakefulness from sleep. Even as he writes these words, he can almost persuade himself that he is dreaming. Yet he does find one probable sign whereby to tell dreaming from waking. Our memory, he observes, can never connect our dreams with one another, or with the whole course of our lives, as it unites events which happen to us while we are awake. Aquinas finds other evidences of difference. When a man is fully asleep, he does not dream at all, for his imagination is inactive, as well as his senses and his mind. But as sleep passes gradually into waking, his faculties begin to act again, not merely the imagination, but the reason also, so that a man may judge that what he sees is a dream, discerning, as it were, between things and their images. Nevertheless, the common sense remains partly suspended, and therefore, although it discriminates some images from reality, yet it is always deceived in some particular. Even while a man is asleep, his sense and imagination may be to some extent free, and similarly the judgment of his intellect may be unfettered, though not entirely. Consequently, if a man syllogizes with sleep, when he wakes up he invariably recognizes a flaw in some respect. Apart from questions of truth and falsity, or reality and illusion, the nature and causes of dreaming are perennial themes in the tradition of Western thought. As different suppositions are made concerning the cause of dreams, so different interpretations are given of their content. When it is supposed that the dream is inspired by the gods or is a divine visitation, it becomes a medium of divination or prophecy, a way of foretelling the future, or of knowing what the gods intend in general, or for the guidance of some particular man. In the great books of ancient poetry and history, and in the Old Testament as well, dreams, like oracles, are interpreted as supernatural portents, and figure as one of the major sources of prophecy. Aristotle discounts both the fulfillment of dreams and their non-fulfillment, for coincidences do not occur according to any universal or general law regarding prophetic dreams as mere coincidences. He does not find it surprising that many dreams have no fulfillment, from the fact that certain of the lower animals also dream. He thinks it may be concluded that dreams are not sent by God, nor are they designed for the purpose of revealing the future. Instead, Aristotle proposes natural causes for the origin of dreams. Slight stimulations of the sense organs awaken the dream process and determine its content. Dreamers fancy that they are affected by thunder and lightning, when in fact they are only faint ringings in their ears, or that they are walking through fire and feeling intense heat, when there is only a slight warmth affecting certain parts of the body. Lucretius similarly explains dreams by natural causes, but attributes their content to events which have dominated the thought of waking life. On whatever things we have before spent much time, he writes, so that the mind was more strained in the task than it is wont. In our sleep, we seem mostly to traffic in the same things. Lawyers think that they plead their cases and confront law with law, generals that they fight and engage in battles, sailors that they pass a life of conflict, wage with the winds. This is true even of animals. Strong horses, when their limbs are lain to rest, Lucretius continues, yet sweat in their sleep, and pant forever, and strain every nerve as though for victory. And hunters' dogs, often in their sleep, yet suddenly toss their legs, and all at once give tongue, and again sniff the air with their nostrils, as if they had found what had found and were following the tracks of wild beasts. In the tradition of the great books, modern writers, like their ancient forebears, appeal thus to sensation and memory as the natural causes of the origin and content of dreams. But except for daydreams or waking fantasy, they do not observe that dreaming may be even more profoundly a product of desire. If Freud's extraordinary insight on this point is supported by all the evidences he assembles in his great work, The Interpretation of Dreams, then the lateness of this discovery may be thought even more extraordinary than the theory itself. The theory is not simply that the content of dreams is determined by desires. When Oedipus tells Jocasta of his fear that in taking her to wife he has unwittingly married his mother, she tells him to fear not, for many men ere now have so fared in dreams also. If that is so, then such dreams do not call for the interpretation which Freud gives. If there are men who suffer from what Freud calls the Oedipus complex, involving repressed incestuous desires, then the expression of those desires in dreaming will not take the form of imagining them to be actually fulfilled. On the contrary, Freud's theory of dream symbolism holds that the dream, as remembered, is not the real thing at all, but a distorted substitute beneath what he calls the manifest dream content. The actual moving images which occupy the dreaming consciousness lie. The latent dream thoughts which are distorted in the actual dream. The distortion is due to the activities of censorship directed against the unacceptable unconscious wish impulses, invariably of an objectionable nature, offensive from the ethical, aesthetic, or social point of view, things about which we do not dare to think at all, or think of only with abhorrence. The repressed desires or wishes, the loves or fears, which the dreamer refuses to acknowledge, consciously must, therefore, appear in dreams in a disguised form. The imagery of dreams seems to Freud to be a kind of language in which the repressed materials of thought and feeling employ a special symbolism to express what the moral censor will not permit us to express in the ordinary language of our conscious thought or social conversation. An ordinary language contains symbols conventionally agreed upon. So Freud finds that the recurrence again and again of certain images in the dreams of neurotic patients and of normal persons as well gives them the character of conventional symbols. The number of things which are represented symbolically in dreams is, according to Freud, not great. They are, he says, the human body as a whole, parents, children, brothers and sisters, birth, death, nakedness, and one thing more. The only typical, that is to say, regularly occurring representation of the human form as a whole is that of a house. When the walls are quite smooth, the house means a man. When there are ledges and balconies which can be caught hold of, a woman. Parents appear in dreams as emperor and empress, king and queen, or other exalted personages. Children and brothers are less tenderly treated, being symbolized by little animals or vermin. Birth is almost invariably represented by some reference to water. For dying, we have setting out upon a journey or traveling by train. Clothes and uniforms stand for nakedness. The one thing more which Freud mentions in his enumeration comprises the sexual organs and acts. In contrast to all the others, these, he says, are represented by a remarkably rich symbolism. An overwhelming majority of symbols in dreams are sexual symbols. Freud points out why it would be a mistake to treat dream symbols like the words of an ordinary language. Their object is not to tell anyone anything. They are not a means of communication. On the contrary, it is important to them not to be understood. Wresting their secret from such symbols is a remarkable achievement. Aristotle's remark, which Freud quotes, that the most skillful interpreter of dreams is he who has the faculty of observing resemblances, seems to be born out in the Freudian method of discovering the latent content of the dream symbolism. But Freud's therapeutic use of what can thus be discovered makes the psychoanalytic method a thing totally unanticipated by any of his predecessors. Progress is at on this 102 ideas. So I can count off the YouTube playlists. I think I have 2 more to be added. Playlist. Great ideas. 38 videos. Minus I don't know if I ever read Great conversation, the substance of a liberal education. Where's the index? Private library edition. I read the preface. Great conversation, part 1, part 2, part 3, great ideas, preface. Some topical construction 3, the introductions. Was that like in this book? Yeah. Preface. Great ideas, preface, the nature of the syntopicon. And then after that you add is that like, where did I read that? Syntopical construction 3, the introductions. What was that? Oh yeah, Appendix 2. This volume. I can't believe how good condition these were. Probably purchased and then just never touched by anybody for a long time. Oh yeah, syntopical construction, which is on the very back of Volume 3. Principles and methods of syntopical construction. Part 1, the great ideas and the inventory of terms. Part 2, the outlines of topics and the cross-references. Part 3, the introductions. Part 4, the references. Part 5, additional readings. And I read Part 3, the introductions, on the stream. 11 pages long. Which was the shortest of all the 5 parts, actually. So, there's a lot more content about the principles and methods of syntopical construction here. The back of Volume 3, Appendix 2, Appendix 1, bibliography, I think. It's interesting. Bibliography. The bibliography of additional readings provides information concerning the authors and works cited and the additional readings. In addition to the full name and dates of each author, the bibliography gives as much of the following information as is appropriate to each work cited: the full title and subtitle, if any, the name of the editor or translator, if translation recommended, the name of the publisher and the date of the publication, the original title, the date, and in some cases the place of composition and or publication. Since the additional readings are 102 separate lists of authors and works, The bibliography is a single compilation of the titles which comprise these 102 lists, each was constructed according to different principles. The following statement of these principles serves to guide the reader in using the bibliography in relation to the additional readings. I see. Okay. Alright, so I mean, I can't imagine I'll be reading all of these in any reasonable amount of time, but I guess that's the point of the library, is you have options. You don't have to have read everything in your library. So I've got 38 videos, and then 2 more videos waiting to be added. Not mistaken. This one and that one. So 1, 2, 3, and then there's a couple of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's a couple that have 2 parts. 1, 2. Okay, so +2 and -7. It's 40 minus 7. So that's 33. 33 out of 102 ideas completed. It's almost a third. 32% complete. And then after I read all these introductions, I have to decide what work I'm going to read, what actual book from the set, not necessarily a whole book, but whatever poem or collection of essays or whatever I want to tackle. Think about it. Summa Theologica is high up there. Obviously, it would be probably the most fun to read fiction. So I could read or an epic poem, whatever that category is. What do they call it? Now I'm curious. They must say imaginative literature, something like that. Must be in the preface. Explanation of color of bindings. Page 86. You will find some guidance in the colors in which the books are bound. The volumes bound in yellow contain epic and dramatic poetry, satires, and novels. Okay. Epic and dramatic poetry, satires, and novels. So we have the Iliad, Achilles, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. And then next in line is Virgil, Dante, Chaucer, Rabelais. I don't know what he's written. Let's look at that. Shakespeare, Cervantes, Milton, Swift and Sterne, Fielding. I don't know who Sterne is. I don't know who Fielding is. Goethe, Melville, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. Some good options. Bound in blue are histories and works in ethics, economics, politics, and jurisprudence. Those bound in green contain mathematics and the natural sciences. Those bound in red contain philosophy and theology. Those bound in green contain mathematics, natural sciences, works in astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology. Histories, works in ethics, economics, politics, and jurisprudence. It's interesting that works in ethics is separate from philosophy. So there's some really interesting history options too. Herodotus, Plutarch, Tacitus. Montaigne is blue. I guess he was a lawyer. Maybe it's considered ethics. But Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That would be a very cool read. But then you have the red-colored ones. Aristotle, Plato, Lucretius, Epictetus, Aurelius, and then you have Plotinus, Augustine, Aquinas, Francis Bacon, Descartes and Spinoza, Pascal, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Hegel. Seems like what Mortimer mostly refers to philosophical and theological works. Sometimes he talks about Montaigne, other people from ethics. Doesn't really reference the works of poetry or satire novels too much. I'd like to read Goethe. I could read War and Peace. That would take a while, probably, but at least it'd be kind of entertaining, I would think. Dante, Chaucer. Pilgrim's Progress is not in here. That was one of the books mentioned in the final list here. Pilgrim's Progress. I wonder if that's in the by John Bunyan, right? I believe it is right here. Yes. Thought about reading that again. So I think about that book a lot. But I always thought that this list was all the books contained in the great books of the Western world. But it's a recommended reading. Books by author and title to indicate a publisher or a particular edition. Almost every work on the list. Appendix A recommended reading list. Books that it would be worth your while to read. We mean the phrase worth your while quite seriously. Although not all of the books listed are great in any of the commonly accepted meanings of the term, all of them will reward you for the effort you make to read them. All of these books are over most people's heads, sufficiently so, at any rate, to force most readers to stretch their minds to understand and appreciate them. And that, of course, is the kind of book you should seek out if you want to improve your reading skills. And at the same time discover the best that has been thought and said in our literary tradition. Some of the books are great in the special sense of the term that we employed in the last chapter. On returning to them, you will always find something new, often many things. They are endlessly rereadable. Another way to say this is that some of the books, we will not say exactly how many, nor will we try to identify them, since to some extent this is an individual judgment, are over the heads of all readers, no matter how skillful. As we observed in the last chapter, these are the works that everyone should make a special effort to seek out. They are the truly great books. They are the books that anyone should choose to take with him to his own desert island. The list is long and it may seem a little overwhelming. We urge you not to allow yourself to be abashed by it. So, most of what he lists, okay. That's interesting. So, titles included in great books of the Western world are identified by a single asterisk. Authors represented in Gateway of the Great Books are identified by a double asterisk. Titles. And then, okay, so titles. So some of these authors, they shout out here as being in the okay, interesting. I wonder if everything that's in the great books here is listed. Probably. But John Bunyan is here. I seem to be mostly interested in the novel writers that he recommends. But in recent history, I've found myself reading stuff like Emerson. More so. Voltaire, David Hume, Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, Karl von Clausewitz, Arthur Schopenhauer. They had a lot of, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And here he recommends Representative Men. I bought that. And read it. Without even knowing it was special recommendation. It did seem like a good... Because there was only like 3 out of 6 or something of the essays in this other collection. My other Emerson collection that I spent so much time reading. The bathroom. My brother's condo. It's essential writings. Where's John Bunyan? I know you recommends him. I wonder if he's in the Gateway. John Milton, William Shakespeare. It's a pretty old book, if I recall. One of the earliest. Geoffrey Chaucer, Calvin, Miguel de Cervantes, Don Quixote. Michael de Montaigne, Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes. Rules for the Direction of the Mind, Discourse on Method, Geometry, Meditations on First Philosophy. Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. That's somewhere in here. Oh. I just want to see that it was on this list. I'm not crazy. Pilgrim's Progress. If it isn't, then what possessed me to ever read that? Wordsworth. Words, Mr. Wordsworth. Voltaire. Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe. It's odd. Song of Roland, 12th century? Marcus Aurelius. The heck, it's like not on this list. Where did I maybe the fact that that was from my college class that I took. Pretty sure that's where I got that copy of it. That's why I have that. Professor Van Tassel. I forget what it was called. It's like Fantastic Adventures or something. Fantastic Journeys. It was a great class, but I didn't read any of the books at the time. So I think I got an F, as I should have. Professor Van Tassel. Yeah, it's not in here, is it? I should just look it up.